In this final solutions presentation, we are going to be talking about disaster relief. In some ways, we've really completed a lot of the solutions because we've talked about a whole bunch of different types of development out there. But disaster relief, which sort of falls outside of the spectrum of trying to improve conditions, is a really important kind of international aid and development that, of course, is pretty well wedded to the particular region theme that we're doing right now, which is, of course, natural hazards. Now, of course, disaster relief is probably the form of aid with which we're most familiar. When we typically think of aid, we think about organizations that step in when there are big natural disasters. And the types of organizations that do this include NGOs, UN agencies, national governments, and the Red Cross. And I'm going to talk about each in turn. So UN agencies are, of course, very important in providing international aid and relief, and one of the reasons why the UN exists. We've talked about a couple of the organizations that do international aid and relief in the time of disasters, including the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, or the UNHCR, and we also talked about the World Health Organization a bit as well. The World Food Program might have come up very briefly in the Latin America region. And UNICEF, which is the Children's Fund, is another organization that does international disaster relief for the UN. A lot of UN disaster relief is handled through a central fund called the Central Emergency Response Fund, or CERF, that countries can donate funds to, including not just countries, but also private donors, especially big foundations, donate money to this as well. Now, the U.S. is not a major contributor to the CERF. It only donates something like $4 to $10 million per year. And that's a lot less than other developed countries in the world, but it's in part because the USAID and other forms of U.S. aid are significantly bigger than the sorts of aid that we funnel via the United Nations. So let's talk a little bit about national governments. Most national governments around the world provide some sort of disaster relief. And of course, the amount that they provide is really based on how big their economy and how big their budget is. So the U.S. provides a great deal to different parts of the world. A significant amount of this comes through the USAID. It has an International Disaster Assistance Fund. In the last year of President Obama's administration, that fund had about $2 billion in it. In the Trump administration, it's unclear exactly how much will be in there, but it's probably going to be less than that $2 billion fund. It's also worth noting, though, that in addition to official international disaster assistance, the Department of Defense also provides disaster relief. This tends to be more discretionary funding, but a number of American military organizations within the armed services provide disaster relief at different times in different ways. And it can be a hefty amount of money, but it's very difficult to disaggregate it from the overall Department of Defense budget. So I'm just going to leave it at a discretionary number that changes from year to year depending on conditions. Now, the International Committee of the Red Cross and the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Organizations is another organization that provides international disaster relief. It's really an NGO, a non-governmental organization. It's really many NGOs. The International Committee of the Red Cross is the international NGO, and then each country has its own Red Cross or Red Crescent, like the American Red Cross, that belongs to the Federation. And each of these organizations, so there are literally, nearly 200 of them, all provide disaster relief and aid in times of crisis. Now, what's unique about the Red Cross is that it is the one organization that is recognized as a relief organization under the Geneva Convention. And it has very specific wartime missions that include not only providing aid to wounded and aid and protection to citizens, but also is responsible for delivering messages and packages to prisoners of war and other combatants. So it's sort of a special NGO compared to the other NGOs, but it has peacetime mission in addition to the wartime mission, and that peacetime mission is much more like the other NGOs. And there are lots of NGOs that do different types of international aid and relief. And I can't go into all of them, but I have just a couple of examples up here. Probably one of the most famous is an organization called Doctors Without Borders, or Médecins Sans Frontières, which is known for providing not just medical care, but other forms of disaster relief in very crisis-ridden situations. In fact, Doctors Without Borders goes into places that other organizations won't because it is too unsafe for those organizations. Another organization that's well known on the west coast of the United States is Mercy Corps. It's based in Portland. It does disaster relief as well as some development work. Shelterbox you might have heard of, particularly if you have some association with Rotary. Maybe those of you who went on Rotary exchanges have heard of Shelterbox before. They actually provide boxes that have in them tents and tools and water purification systems and things like that that are delivered in times of natural disaster to people who need to immediately have some place to sleep. Very interesting organization, and if you are able to fund an entire box, you can actually track its progress as it moves to a disaster zone, which is pretty interesting. In addition to these organizations and many, many others, there are lots of different faith-based organizations that do disaster relief. I'm not going to have time to go into all of these. Just a couple of last notes to make about disaster relief. One thing is that we shouldn't forget this issue of effectiveness. We should make sure that we know that organizations we're giving to that do disaster relief do what they're supposed to do, and the money is going where it's supposed to go, just as we did with other organizations. So that's something to think about, especially if you consider donating in the time of crisis. But one thing to know about crisis situations is that they get pretty complicated, and it is not uncommon, especially in the case of the Red Cross, which is so large, that sometimes money is misappropriated, sometimes it's lost in the chaos that takes place during a major disaster or during an armed conflict. And that's something that is definitely problematic and needs to be reduced as much as possible, but to some extent is inevitable as well. And then just the final thing I wanted to say about international disaster relief is that there's an increasing move in the disaster relief community to encourage people to transfer cash to people who need help. There's often a desire to do things like send clothes or food to parts of the world that need this sort of aid, but the reality is that these are extremely expensive and extremely ineffective ways to deliver aid. One of the most important things that you can do is just give people cash, and once you give them cash, they can not only buy the stuff they need, but they can start rebuilding local economies that have often been devastated in the time of natural disaster. So these are all some things to consider and think about as you think about the issue of disaster relief.